he may still have this. He may still have the clout, but if he had any sense of wrong, he would just say, okay, so people don't want to go through. Why do they want to get through? They want fun for somebody to do. So, yeah, so I would get, I mean, if I would get, I mean, I would have, the thing that disappoints me is we saw in when people say, I never looked that up here. These people, and I watched the outtakes. Again, I just watched yesterday what Thompson said about Mike Pence getting a freedom or whatever. I can support it. He would be in real trouble. I'm sorry, I don't know other people who support it. Again, in my opinion, people who support it definitely deserve it. They were. Oh yeah. It is amazing to me how many people body whether it's grievances or whether the body thinks it's wrong or whatever it may be, he's a salesman, you gotta give him credit for being a good salesman. I don't know if anybody's it might be Lincoln or they're always going to be. It was all about it ended up it was all about and I think but
Join me at CMC.
Get engaged and get educated.
Join me at CMC. Everyone is welcome.
Join me at CMC.
Come grow your relationships.
Join us at CMC.
CMC is real,
authentic conversation.
Engage with curious people.
Plus, we give you access to thought leaders.
Be informed, be inspired.
Through community conversation.
Come here and meet your neighbors.
Be here in the room.
Ask questions,
get answers.
Connecting people and ideas.
Learn about Columbus.
Who will you see at CMC?
Join me at CMC.
You're invited. Watch us on live stream or in person.
You're invited.
Join the conversation.
You're invited.
Welcome to CMC.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We're about to get started, so I'm going to ask you to quiet down in here. Hello. Welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. Founded in 1976 by 13 visionary women leaders, CMC's mission is to connect people and ideas through community conversation. From its beginning, CMC has welcomed everyone. I'm Kelly Atkinson, the Director of Business Systems for Barnes & Thornburg. And I've never said that out loud before, so it's really weird to say it, but that change is effective this Saturday. So thanks for bearing with me on that. I'm also the chair of the CMC Board of Trustees. So let's begin by meeting our newest CMC members. We have Christine Mortine with Christine Aviation. Hi. Eric Brembeck with Studio 35 Cinema and Draft House. We have Emily Critchbaum with the Columbus School for Girls. Destiny Ward with Browtique, maybe. Jeffrey Wilkins with the Facilities Management Express. We have Susan Menke with Abentra Behavioral Science Consulting. I'm sorry, I have no idea how to say some of these things. Not sure if you're here. We have Judith Chess and Sally Crane Cox. And finally, Brian Stark with the Ultimate Battery Company. So love all the new members. Thank you so much for joining. If you are not already a CMC member, we encourage you to join. It's easy enough to do through the CMC website, or if you're already a CMC member, don't forget to sign up for different events that we have going on, including our private behind-the-scenes tour of the brand new WOSU Public Media Studios. And yes, Mike Thompson will be there. That is coming up July 21st at 4 p.m., so go take a look. Please also take a moment to look at the back of your forum flyers. You will see on the back of that a bunch of different organizations that really help the not-for-profit Columbus Metropolitan Club by providing half of its annual revenue. Wouldn't you like to see your organization also listed amongst all of those great people there, or those great companies? If you would like to do that, you can see Lainey Cuthbert in the back of the room back here, or Jane Scott up here. They will help you to get set up with all of that. I tell everyone all the time, it's the best deal in town. You want to make sure that you're supporting something like this because it also makes you look good by supporting such a great organization. All right. So thank you. I'm going to make all of these other thank yous, right? Thank you to WOSU Public Media, CMC's partner for the Democracy in Crisis series. This series begins with today's forum, and it continues monthly for the remainder of the year. Today's forum is also supported by the Columbus Dispatch, and today's live stream is presented by the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. So let's thank all of those supporting today's forum. And I also want to make one more little call out of who we should be thanking is the Book Lot for being here today with all of the books up in the front of the room if you're interested after listening to today. So thank you too. All right. The Democracy in Crisis series of monthly CMC forums will examine how democracy is being challenged here in the U.S. and even internationally. To launch our series, we're honored to welcome Michael Tomasky, editor of The New Republic and the author of If We Can Keep It, How the Republic Collapsed and How It Might Be Saved, and our host, Mike Thompson, Chief Content Director for News and Public Affairs with WOSU Public Media. You can learn more about today's speakers in your forum flyer. Mike, we really look forward to today's conversation.
Thanks, Kelly. Michael, welcome to Columbus.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks to the Metropolitan Club. Thanks to Jane. Thanks to my sister, Susan Tomasky, who helped engineer this. And I want to thank all of you for coming. I look forward to our chat. Love being here.
At the start of the pandemic, if you remember back into March of 2020, I was reading two books. One was The Great Influenza, which really documents the 1918 flu. Yeah. And also Philip Roth's The Plot Against America, which talks about an authoritarian ruler taking over the United States in 1940. I was having trouble sleeping during that spring. I read your book last month, and a similar feeling overcame me.
Didn't help.
And slept in my sleep. So we'll get into that, and hopefully we'll all be able to sleep a little bit better after this discussion. But
I wouldn't count on it.
We as Americans, maybe as human beings, think Everything is brand new. This has never, ever happened before. Either that, or like in 1918, we forget the lessons we should have learned from something like the influenza and move on with our lives. We are certainly polarized right now, very polarized. We all would agree on that. But we have been here before. In fact, you argue we have always been this way.
Pretty much. The book came out in early 2019, and I did, a number of events for the book, and I had a sort of standard little talk, which always started something like this. People think we've been polarized since the 90s, and they're right, the 1790s. Yes, people chuckled nervously then too. And so that's, Mike, where the book starts and how it opens. And it's really true. And yes, it's gotten worse since the 1990s. We all know that. Many of us have lived through that. But the roots of the two Americas that are today at loggerheads, nay, war with each other, go back to the beginning of the Republic. The shorthand labels for these groups at the time were the Jeffersonians versus the Hamiltonians, Jeffersonians versus Hamiltonians, or the Democratic Republican Party of Jefferson versus the Federalist Party of Hamilton. They don't map exactly onto today's Republican and Democratic parties, but certain traits do certainly stand out. The Jeffersonians were the yeoman farmers, the rural people, the infantrymen in the Continental Army, and the people who, like rural people today, were suspicious of a large federal government, suspicious of central power, didn't like taxes very much. The Federalist Hamiltonians were the city slickers, the people who believed in manufacturing, the educated elites, the officers in the Continental Army, the members of the High Episcopal Church, the quote-unquote classier denominations. And so these divides existed then and have existed in many ways ever since. And, the divisions were deep in the 1790s and into the early 1800s, and they disagreed about everything. They disagreed about, first of all, many of them disagreed about whether independence was desirable. There were Federalists, as I said, but there were anti-Federalists too. The Federalists, of course, wrote the Federalist Papers, agitated for ratification of the Constitution. The anti-Federalists agitated against ratification of the Constitution and made some pretty prescient arguments, actually. I read a lot of their pamphlets, and they said things like, look, this is impossible. This is too big and too varied and too diverse a place to be turned into one country. We just disagree about too much. The argument for republic held the day because the vast majority of them took the consensus that to break away from England and to form our own country, the 13 colonies needed to form a united front. And independence was the first priority. Slavery, a lot of them didn't like, but we'd settle that question later. Well, that question only got settled, of course, at the barrel of a gun some decades later. Anyway, that's how it started, and that's kind of how it's been.
You're right that the founders were human. They made lots of mistakes in how they set up this government and this republic. Is there any one mistake that they made that you think is costing us the most right now?
The Senate. So when we were in school, we were taught that the Senate was the result of what was known by two names: the Connecticut Compromise, because it was crafted by Roger Sherman of Connecticut, chiefly, others as well, but chiefly Sherman. And then it's also called the Great Compromise, right? We learned that in school. So what is that phrase, the great compromise, supposed to tell us, supposed to make us think? It's supposed to make us think that it was great and that everybody was pleased by it, and that it ended some debate, and everybody shook hands and hugged and drank champagne and was happy. Nobody was happy. Nobody was happy. The Connecticut Compromise passed at the Constitutional Convention. I believe the vote was 5-4 to 2 abstentions. So it passed by one. The states, and this is another question. This you want to talk about beginning weird questions like why? Why did each of the 13 states have an equal vote at the Constitutional Convention when they were so different in population? That's a weird one too. But anyway, 5-4 to 2. New York was absent that day, and there's this long-running debate among constitutional scholars about how New York might have voted. So the whole thing might have failed if New York had shown up. A lot of these guys, there were 55 guys, and they couldn't be there the whole time. It went from June to September of 1787, and they had to get back to tend their crops and whatever they had to do, and they'd go back and forth between their home states and Philadelphia. The day after it passed, the 4 states that voted against it met that morning and said, what are we going to do about this? This is a disaster. This is insane to have, Virginia and Rhode Island both have 2 senators. This is crazy. At the time, Virginia was the most populous. I believe Rhode Island was the least populous, and Virginia had 14 times the number of citizens that Rhode Island had. Today, California has 70 times the number of citizens that Wyoming has. So a Wyomingan has 70 times the voting power in the Senate that a Californian does. So they were aware that this was a problem. This wasn't a great compromise. This was a lousy compromise, and it passed by 1 vote. And a lot of people didn't like it. And they met the next morning to see what they were going to do about it. They couldn't come to a consensus on a plan B, and they had other pressing business to get to, so they just dropped it. One guy from New Jersey, then a small state, even proposed that they redraw state boundary lines to try and ensure a more equitable distribution of population. Not a crazy idea. I kind of wish they'd done it. They did it in Paris. They did it in the French Revolution. Départements, if you look at a map of France, they're all small. They're all about the same size. They did it. We didn't. The Senate was a big mistake.
What was their reasoning? Why the advocates for this system? Was it based in maintaining slavery? Was it the Southern colonies that wanted to make sure they had enough votes to maintain it?
Yeah, it was partly slavery, and it was partly the small states, is the small states, saying, big states are going to overrun us. And that was an argument that held a lot of sway, and it still holds a lot of sway. In any state with big cities and rural areas, the rural people complain that the big city is going to overrun us. And I'm sure that happens here. It happens a lot in Michigan, a favorite state, I know, of so many Ohioans, where rural Michiganders have complained for years and years and years, decades and decades, about, Detroit's going to overrun us and we're not going to have any power. So they stacked the state legislature in the direction of rural parts of Michigan in just an obscene way. Michigan was as bad as Mississippi. You'll be happy to hear.
What makes our polarization now different than what we've experienced before?
Well, that is a great question. I think we have reached a point where, let me look at this, answer this in 2 ways. The first in terms of Congress and our politics, and the second just in terms of the broader country and our culture. In Congress, there's very little effort to compromise anymore. And this has happened, since the 60s. And it's happened for a variety of reasons. So historically, America's political parties were very unique. in England and in continental Europe, when they started to get rid of kings and switch toward democratic parliamentary systems, they formed political parties. And in most countries, they formed a party of the left and a party of the right. All right? Britain had the liberals and the conservatives, most notably. Germany, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. In the United States, we didn't have that. Our parties weren't ideological in that way. There was a ton of ideological overlap within our parties, and it's a very important point to understand. And it happened for some very particular historical reasons. One was slavery, and the fact that they decided not to settle the slavery question at the beginning, and to win a national election. The Democratic Republicans, the Federalists, later the Democrats, founded actually by Martin Van Buren, not by Thomas Jefferson or Andrew Jackson, and the Whigs, founded in opposition to Jackson/Van Buren's Democrats in the 1830s. All these parties knew that to win a national election, they had to win votes in both the North and the South. So they could not electorally, if they wanted to prevail in the Electoral College, they couldn't take a firm position against or for slavery. So that was one reason that made the parties kind of a mishmash. Another one was the way the country grew. Because as territories became states, these states, new states, had to sort out what their political inclination was going to be, and that varied from place to place. So you had, for example, the Republican Party, which started to form in the 1850s here in Ohio, notably, but first in Wisconsin, but here in the Great Lakes region. But the Republicans, as the country grew, those Republicans stood for a certain set of things, anti-slavery being central to it. But I just wonder if she's going to find her friends there. As the country grew, different regions that had different interests had to make alliances with the already existing portions of the country. And this made for parties that were a real ideological mishmash. So the Republicans were Yankee, moderates from the New England states, free soilers from Ohio and Wisconsin, and then agrarians from the Midwest and so on. All of them kind of different. The Democratic Party was even worse. The Democratic Party was the party of the urban machines of the North, the party of Boss Tweed, and the apartheid, racist, segregationist party of the South, who disagreed about most things, but for some reason they stayed in the same party to win elections, to win presidential elections. So, as a result, through the mid-20th century, the Democratic and Republican parties had a ton of overlap. And the National Journal, the publication based in Washington, used to do this every year. I think they've stopped bothering because there's no point anymore, but they used to measure this overlap. And how many liberal Republicans were there and how many conservative Democrats were there. And there were always 15, 18, 22 senators in this overlap area. That stopped happening in about 2010, and now there's no overlap. So even Joe Manchin is more liberal than the most liberal Republican senator. And I forget who the most liberal Republican senator is. It's probably Mitt Romney, I guess, or some, but he's more conservative than Joe Manchin. So there's zero overlap, and there's zero overlap even in the House of Representatives now, 435 people. So that's one thing that's happened. And then more broadly, I would say just our politics has become so cultural and so consuming about everything we do. Do you shop at Whole Foods? You're probably a Democrat. Do you drive a Volvo? You're probably a Democrat. Do you drive a Ford F-150? You're probably a Republican. And so on and so on. And just what TV shows you watch, what teams you cheer for, what sports you're interested in. It's all now infused through some kind of political sieve that heightens divisions.
Can you blame either party In your book, you take aim at Republicans because they've really become much more unified and ideological, where the Democrats are still more of a coalition, disorganized, as Will Rogers would say. Yeah. Can you blame either Democrats or Republicans? Do they share the blame? Does one get more blame?
No, the Republicans do get more blame in my eyes, and it goes back to, Gingrich was, I think, the first actor here, and he explicitly said that he wanted to heighten the distinctions and make Washington more partisan. There's a famous quote from him that's in the book. I can't remember it exactly, but it's something like, a reporter asked him why he never served in Vietnam. He got a deferment, of course. And he said, I guess I felt that I had a different war to fight here at home. War, okay? He used the war metaphor in talking about members of a different political party. This was really different. Remember, at the time, Washington, not only was there all this overlap, but it was run by men, mostly men then, and today still, but mostly men then, almost wholly men, who came of age in the Depression and during World War II, two events that really made the country kind of pull together and made for a more communal ethos that extended into the post-war era. And if you look at the great senators and House leaders and presidents too of the 50s and 60s, they all lived through both of those experiences, and they knew that hardship. I mean, one story that I love that I tell in the book is that, Bob Dole, and a Republican senator from Kansas, and two Democratic senators, Phil Hart of Michigan and Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, convalesced after the war, recovering from their injuries in the same hospital in Battle Creek, Michigan. And when you get to know somebody like that, you don't use war metaphors against them. There was a time while they were debating the Civil Rights Act, where the Democrats ran the Senate, and the Democrats were mostly, not wholly, because there were still Southern Democrats who were racist, who were dead set against the bill, but it was mostly Northern liberal Democrats who were pushing the Civil Rights Bill. He Shields told me this story one day when he and I were sitting in the Senate gallery watching some disastrous, horrible thing happen. He said, I was a young reporter in 1964, and they used to give us a press briefing every morning on the progress being made on the Civil Rights Bill. And the briefing was given outside of Everett Dirksen's door. Dirksen was the Republican minority leader. And finally, somebody asked Mike Mansfield, top aide, Mansfield was the Democratic majority leader, why are these briefings outside Dirksen's door? Shouldn't they be outside your door? Don't you want the credit for this? And the aide said, the majority leader believes that this bill is so important that the American people need to see that both parties are behind this. And both parties were. It took a lot of Republicans voted for it as well. Imagine that happening today.
On the Republican Revolution, Newt Gingrich, that was a response to some of the war on poverty, to use the term war, from Lyndon Johnson. Some of those programs were very good: Medicare, Medicaid, public housing, not so good. Do Democrats bear some responsibility there? Because they did control the branches of government for a long time, in the time leading up to the 1990s.
Yeah, they bear some responsibility, and they ran the show in the 60s and 70s, and they didn't do everything right. I would argue that if you look at the statistics and the Great Society programs, they really did reduce poverty dramatically. Elderly poverty in particular went way, way down after the passage of Medicare. Child poverty went way, way down after the passage of Medicaid. So I would defend those programs. But then there were failures, and the welfare state became sclerotic, and there were big problems with welfare policy, and then crime was a big problem that the Democrats didn't seem to respond to. So those were the roots of the backlash. But I think the backlash also contained, it came from the Roe decision and the politicization of the Southern Baptist Church, which up to that point had been pretty resolutely non-political. So yeah, it takes two to tango, and then even in the 90s, Democrats did certain things to they're not angels, they're not blameless. But Gingrich really drove this train, I think, and then the rise of the Republican media. It was around that time that talk radio started, and Rush Limbaugh started up in the early 1990s, I believe it was, and so the two media realities have had a whole lot to do with this.
We'll pick on the media in a moment, but and we like to pick on politicians as well. But you're right that politics is a lagging indicator, that politicians follow the people. So how does that square with what you're saying about how the system has not worked, but we the people, to coin a phrase, put that system in place?
Yeah, we did, and I think when I write that, what I mean is that politicians, they wait to see what people think. There's the famous quote from the French politician of the mid-19th century: "There go my people. I must find out where they are going so I can lead them." I forget the man's name. Somewhat unfair, actually. He was kind of a leader, actually, if you read a little bit more about this guy. And there's a metro station named after him somewhere in the 15th arrondissement or something like that. But yeah, politicians generally follow, but there was, I would also say, starting in the 70s, a very concerted effort among American conservatives to invest millions and millions and millions of dollars in politics in a way they hadn't before. You all know how many billions corporations spend on lobbying now. They didn't do that in the 1960s and 70s. They just didn't do it. It didn't occur to them. And, politicians then wouldn't even take that kind of money. Jamie Whitten of Mississippi chaired the Defense Committee, Defense Appropriations Subcommittee in the House of Representatives for many, many years. He had certain downsides to him, certainly when it came to race. But on the question of campaign contributions, finally, at some point in the 1970s, some defense contractor wanted to send him a check, and he said, "What are you doing? I can't take money from you." So that's pretty different. So yeah, but the conservative establishment, and we know today the Kochs and the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute and all these things didn't exist. So all that was a conscious effort begun in 1971 to change the political dynamic, and they've been pretty successful.
Turning back to the media and conservative media, I remember when they put Rush Limbaugh on the radio station where I worked in central Massachusetts at the time, and Mike Dukakis was losing or had just lost, and it was really a shock to the system. But he saved AM radio, became very popular. Fox News, of course, soon followed. We don't just have one or two channels anymore. We have hundreds, thousands, plus feeds on Facebook and Twitter. Yeah. How has that led to our polarization?
Well, obviously people get the news they want, and they listen to the sources they want. And liberals mostly watch MSNBC and CNN and read the New York Times and follow Twitter feeds that they want to follow. And conservatives read Fox or watch Fox and Newsmax and One America and listen to Sinclair radio stations and local broadcast stations and read Facebook feeds that they want to read. And I saw, some of you may have seen shortly after the Mueller report came out, an interview with a woman who only watched Fox, and she had no idea that there was a single critical sentence in the Mueller report about Donald Trump. She just didn't know that it was there. So, and if you compare MSNBC and CNN on the one hand, which do basically the same kind of thing, MSNBC more avowedly liberal in prime time, and compare what they present to what Fox presents. They're different worlds. It's not just like there's this fact and we disagree about it. There's two whole different fact sets.
We have, in our new newsroom, we have many more TVs than we had before. We have CNN and Fox right next to each other. It is two different worlds. I used to watch Fox, but not all day. Like I can monitor it all day like now. And it's a very, I don't want to use the word dystopian, but Fox has a dystopian view of the world right now. We're getting invaded. You know, Biden, gas prices go up, but they never come down.
Yeah.
CNN, more down the middle.
Yeah.
How do you get folks to watch the other, to see what their neighbor is listening to? How do you get a Fox viewer to watch MSNBC? How do you get an MSNBC viewer to watch Fox? Can you?
I don't know if you can. I mean, you know, let's not forget, still in this country, I'm sure many of you have good, close friends who are from the other political party, and you either don't talk about politics or you kind of talk about it, but you talk about it gingerly and politely. I, too, have some Republican conservative friends, particularly from my hometown, Morgantown, West Virginia, guys I went to high school with and stuff. And, you know, we still have points of commonality. You know, we love our Mountaineers and, you know, we have our shared memories and
Is that
stuff.
part of the problem that we avoid? We have friends who we know we disagree with, family members we
Yeah.
know we disagree with, but we don't want to ruin the Thanksgiving dinner.
Right.
Is that a contributing factor as well?
Yeah, it probably is, but, you know, do you want to ruin your Thanksgiving dinner?
No. But, you know, we just avoid, I mean, we Midwesterners are great at avoiding things, but
Yeah.
we avoid anything that could cause problem as a human being.
Yeah.
Let's get to some of these solutions. If you could change one thing today, again, back to the one mistake that the founders made, if you could change one thing today you think would help close this gap, what would it be?
Well, you know, it's hard to limit it to one thing, so I'm going to cheat and give more than one thing. But the first thing is I would just get rid of the United States Senate. Thank you. I'm glad to see that got some applause, not for my sake, but for the sake of the idea. I mean, John Dingell wrote a cover story, you know, the congressman from Michigan the late congressman from Michigan wrote a cover story in the Atlantic magazine a couple years ago, Abolish the Senate. It doesn't serve any good purpose. And, you know, most other countries have unicameral legislatures. England, okay, has its House of Lords, but what year did they pass the Reform Act that defanged the House of Lords and made it largely ceremonial? Anybody know? Some of you know, I'm sure. 1909, okay? So more than a century ago, they realized this doesn't work for popular sovereignty or majority rule or anything like that. So that's the first thing I'd do, is just get rid of the United States Senate. If you want to have a body that's less unruly than the whole House to do things like treaties and confirmations, you can choose a kind of a college of cardinals among senior House members. You know, the Speaker and the Minority Leader can appoint 30 people to such a committee to handle confirmations and stuff like that. You don't need a Senate. Another thing I'd do, Mike, is and this is probably not going to get applause, expand the size of the House of Representatives. No one? No takers? Okay.
Those are the folks running for Congress who want to run for Congress.
We have 435 for a country of 330 million. England, what is it, 90 million people? You know how many people are in the House of Commons? 600 and something.
Wow.
I did a study while I was researching the book. I just went from country to country. How large are the constituencies of each of these parliaments? And they tend to be in the neighborhood of 100,000 to 130,000 constituents. Our members of Congress represent 750,000 people. That's not tenable. That's not close to the ground democracy. Now, if you prorated it out and made it 130,000, we'd have 3,000 people in the House of Representatives. I don't think we quite want to do that. But I think we should think about ways to expand the size of the House of Representatives. And there are people thinking about this. And not only expand the size, but change the way some of them are elected. Single-member districts are bad. for a lot of reasons. It would take me too long to go into the details, but you can actually go see about this online, or there's some very clever YouTube videos devoted to explaining why single-member districts help foster polarization and aren't very good in terms of representation. I mean, basically, you take like Germany, just very quickly. Germany has a form of proportional representation, which means that every party, and Israel too, Israel might be an even more prominent example that many of you will connect with, but Israel has 120 seats in the Knesset, and all these tiny parties have 1 seat, 2 seats, 4 seats, and then they have to make these coalitions. If you are a Green in the United States, or let's say you want to be a member of the pro-AR-15 party on the right, you don't have representation. You don't have party representation, you know? So a lot of people get left behind by a two-party system. So there's a lot of talk about multi-member districts and ranked choice voting. These are things that also might, over time, produce more moderate winners. Ranked choice voting, for example, because if you're not the voter's number 1 choice, you have to work to kind of try to be their number 2 choice, right? And if you have to be their number 2 choice, you can't go around throwing nuclear bombs all the time because you're going to make people mad. You want the bulk of the electorate to like you. So ranked choice voting, a larger House of Representatives, and multi-member districts can help moderate our politics a little bit.
Those changes would require constitutional amendments, which is very difficult. One change would not be that difficult, in theory. In the United States Senate, they equate going to a simple majority vote to nuclear Armageddon. And that's because of the filibuster. What should be done with the filibuster?
Yeah, I'm against the filibuster. I have been for a long time. First of all, it just violates a basic principle of what we are taught from the time we're little kids is fair play, is that the majority rules, right? Majority rules. You know, if 9 friends are together and they're voting on something and the vote comes 5-4 in favor of a certain outcome, nobody disputes that outcome carries the day. But that's not how the United States Senate works at all. In the United States Senate, to extend the analogy, it would take 7 maybe of the 9 to make sure that something passes, giving 3 the effective right of the majority. And that's how the Senate works. 41 people are effectively the majority in the United States Senate because 41 people can block anything. There's a lot of literature from a lot of the founders saying that this was a bad idea. And of course, the filibuster was not in the Constitution. The filibuster was developed in the 1830s and more into the 1840s and used mostly to defend slavery and then later to block civil rights legislation. It's terrible. It's poisonous. It's un-American, it's anti-democratic, and you know, it halts the Senate from doing stuff. In the old days, in the days that I was talking about earlier, the pre-90s days when there was all that overlap, it didn't matter that much because there was compromise. But in a time when there's no compromise, you can't get 60 people to agree on anything. It blocks the Democrats more than it blocks the Republicans, I'll say that, because the Democrats have a more extensive legislative agenda than the Republicans do. And then there's the concern that some people express that, well, if you lower it to 51, fine, the Democrats can pass all the stuff they want to pass when they have power, but then the Republicans can get in office and pass what they want to pass or undo what the Democrats did. Well, I have 2 answers to that. Number 1, yeah, I guess they could, but that's democracy. You know, they won the election. So if they have 51 votes, they have 51 votes. That's life. The second answer is they can't undo a lot of stuff once it's done. Like if a Democratic Senate, Congress raised the minimum wage to $13, the Republicans really going to roll back a minimum wage increase? No. Let them try. They're not going to do that. That's, you know, insanely unpopular, and they won't do it. And there's proof that I'm right. There's proof both from England, where the Tories wanted to roll back the NHS when they took power in the 1950s, couldn't do it. Tried a lot, couldn't do it. And of course, the Republicans wanted to repeal Obamacare, voted 72 times in the House to repeal Obamacare, campaigned on repealing Obamacare, said if we go to our graves, we're going to repeal Obamacare. Never succeeded at doing it. It's hard to undo stuff once it's done.
Social Security, Medicare, all the same
All
story.
these things, same story.
We have, we're going to go to audience questions in just a moment. If you have a question, please go to the microphone. If you are watching us online on YouTube, type your question into the chat function. Michael, let's do the end run scenario. How do we get out of this? Give us your best case scenario and your worst case scenario.
Well, the best case scenario is something like this, I guess. I mean, it's in the news this week, and both scenarios, let's face it, revolve around Donald Trump to a considerable extent. So it's in the news this week, that Times poll that came out yesterday that many of you may have seen, that, Republicans may be peeling away from Donald Trump to some extent. Now, if they nominate someone else, I think at least that person, if he loses, will abide by the result. So I think.
Small victories, I guess.
Yeah. So, at least there's that. And, then, I'm not very sanguine about it. I don't really have a great best case scenario for you, I'm sorry to say, because one thing that's also happening is more Marjorie Taylor Greenes and Lauren Boeberts are winning primaries. So there are going to be more of those folks in Congress who obviously aren't there to compromise. They're there to burn the place down. So that's a tough one to deal with. So that raises the question of how does the Republican Party ever moderate away from its current, trajectory? And I don't really have a great answer to that. I don't know. Just if they lose enough elections and enough time passes and the next generation takes the torch, maybe they'll decide that, we need to do more to pursue, Black votes and Latino votes and do more to reach youth. And I do think if Texas becomes blue, which isn't impossible in 2028, then they'll reassess.
You want to talk about a worst case?
Oh, we're getting to that.
Okay.
But yeah, so if Texas, so we've seen Arizona and Georgia fall, and they're both very close, mind you, and it's not like they're blue states, but they went Biden. If Texas went Democratic in 2028, then the Republicans would have to do, I think, some very serious reassessing, because if Texas is out of their reach in the Electoral College, there's no way they can win a presidential election at all. So that's my kind of best case scenario, I guess, that change is forced upon the Republicans by defeat. The worst case scenario is very clear, right? It's that Trump runs, is the nominee in 2024, loses, by 8 million popular votes, 10 million popular votes, but narrowly enough in 5 states that he can contest it, and that this time he succeeds and overturns it. So then, how much of a democracy are we if that happens? And then he gets into office. In January 2017, he didn't know the structure of the federal government. He didn't know where the weak points were. Now he knows. What's he going to do with his power this time? What kind of people is he going to appoint to run the Justice Department? to run, to be his chief of staff, to be the White House counsel. You know, we have a White House counsel who this past week rather bravely stood up and did the right thing with respect to January 6th. Is he going to make that, from his perspective, mistake again? No. He's going to fill the administration with complete lackeys. And then, you know, I fear that we're going to be in a situation where it's just, you know, democracy is not going to die overnight, I don't think. That's just not how it works. I mean, if you look at, like, it's not how it works today. You know, there's no, you know, Donald Trump is, you know, is who he is, but, you know, he's not Adolf Hitler, and, you know, can't ban the other political party. I don't think that can happen in the United States. These things happen more subtly these days. And if you look at, like, what Viktor Orban has done in Hungary, that's still on paper a democracy. There are opposition parties. There's a notionally free press. There's a notionally independent judiciary. You can stand in the town square in Budapest and criticize Viktor Orban and not get arrested. But for all intents and purposes, only Fidesz can win elections. And Fidesz cronies control the media. So the country's going to be something like that if this happens. And that's, you know, that's bad enough.
Okay. It is the CMC's tradition to take questions from our audience. If you have a question, please go up to the microphone. Tell us who you are. Please keep your questions brief. No political statements, please. Jane, go ahead.
Well, I have quite a lot of questions online, and we'll do every other one. So if you have a question, line up here. Michael, William Wason from the Ohio State University says, how do you think we can restore, quote, perfect democracy when public faith in all of our major institutions has been methodically and intentionally undermined for the past 50 years?
Yeah. Well, you know, a lot of the undermining in the faith in our institutions has been the fault of people running those institutions. I mean, and you know, a lot of the trust in government disappeared in the first instance, right, with Watergate and the Vietnam War. And, you know, the Vietnam War was a lie to the American people and a tragedy that unnecessarily cost 58,000 American lives and like around 2 million Vietnamese lives. And, you know, that was a Democrat. I mean, it was bipartisan, but it was a Democratic president. And then Watergate was, you know, a more intentional crime. And you know, that caused a lot of problems. So things started there, but I would say that in more recent years, the conservative media in particular has sought to discredit mainstream and what they would call liberal institutions of all kinds, you know, and just faith in facts and faith in science and things like that, and have come under very steady attack, and you know, such that, you know, people don't believe in these institutions anymore. But it's also the case that these institutions have failed to deliver for people, and this gets into an economics discussion. But you know, people do expect when the Democrats get elected and control the House and the Senate and the presidency that they're going to pass some things. And they did pass some things. The record isn't entirely bleak, but they didn't pass the big thing that they said they were going to pass. And it's not Joe Biden's fault. It's largely the fault of that other Joe. But you know, when people see that, they lose faith. And that goes back farther. I mean, we've had a middle class that's been falling behind, you know, the upper class for 40 years. And the system hasn't responded well enough. And that's what helps create this working class rage.
And that is the subject of your next book.
It is, in fact, the subject of my next
You teed it
book.
up
Very,
beautifully.
very perceptively done, Mike. Yeah, and I'll plug that before we close. But let's
Okay, it
take
comes
some
out in September.
questions.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Lemichuk with CareSource. Two quick questions. Supreme Court, do we need term and age limits instead of this lifetime appointment, which is hard for me to process that? And do we need a new third political party to maybe change things and get us moving in the right direction?
I would certainly be for Supreme Court term limits, and a lot of people are. The generally agreed upon idea is around 18 years, and to have them staggered in such a way that every two-term president gets 2 appointees. The question of whether the Democrats should pack the court, I'm not quite to that point. I'm almost to that point. The Constitution doesn't say it has to be 9, so a president can make it any size they want. I don't know. I don't know about that. I mean, there might be repercussions to trying to do that. There were when Roosevelt tried, and he dropped it, obviously. But yeah, I mean, it would be nice to think that someday we can get to the point where the two parties can sit down and talk about a certain level of Supreme Court reform. What was the second?
Third party?
Yeah, third party,
Alternate
yeah. That's impossible under a single-member district system. Single-member districts produce 2 parties. There's this thing called Duverger's law. Maurice Duverger, a French political scientist of the mid-20th century. You can Google him. He explains it all. But it's basically impossible under a single-member district system, which produces 2 parties. Also, under our electoral college, it's very hard because a third-party candidate can get 10% of the vote, 12% of the vote, 19% of the vote, as Ross Perot did in 1992, but not come close to winning a single electoral vote. So it just doesn't have any impact at the presidential level.
Well, and this next question is relative to that. Speak to the Electoral College history and any historical attempts to change, and how might we change it?
Well, it was put in place to protect the interests of the slaveholding states, and it worked. And it's not an accident that 6 of the first 7 presidents were from slaveholding states, and I think themselves all slaveholders, I think. People have been complaining about it since the beginning of the Republic. And, for example, I mean, here's how that worked. There were more free people in Pennsylvania than there were in Virginia, but Virginia had a huge number of slaves, and because of the 3/5 clause, 3/5 of that population counted toward the Electoral College, so it ended up giving Virginia more representation in the Electoral College than Pennsylvania, even though Pennsylvania had more voters. So that kind of thing. The main idea for reforming today is this thing called national popular vote, a compact among states whereby they agree to give their electoral votes to the candidate who won the popular vote. And of course, mostly it's blue states agreeing to this. A number of states have agreed to this. I think 19 state legislatures have signed on to this. And it would, if enough places adopted it, it would ensure that the person who won the popular vote became the president, which is a real crisis right now, because in two of our last 5 elections, that came out the other way.
Sir, your question.
Hello, my name is Brian Stark. First of all, a question. As I recall, Texas could turn blue, but I think Texas still has the right to transform itself into 5 states.
Yeah.
My question is, both the CIA and the British equivalent have said that China is infiltrating all of our media. And my question is, will Congress ever wake up to the fact that the real threat isn't among themselves, but is China, which is goal is to be the number one country in the world within the next 10 or 20 years.
All
And I
right.
have this feeling that Congress sits there fiddling while, quote, Rome burns.
I think people are plenty alarmed about China. I don't know that there's a big consensus on what to do about it, or there's also like a question as to what kind of power the United States has to block China. Okay, so China has this bridge and road initiative, and they're financing all these infrastructure projects in the developing world. Okay, does the United States want to spend, $400 billion a year doing that, or $1 trillion a year doing that? I don't know how much China spends, but they're building all kinds of ports and rail links and highways in all kinds of countries all around the world. And they're saying to these countries, the United States is no longer your model. It's no longer much of a democracy anyway, if you haven't noticed, people. We're not a democracy. We don't claim to be. We're not hypocritical. But we are making our people prosperous, and we can make your people prosperous. So they're doing that. I don't know what our power is, as long as they're spending the money they're spending to stop that. But there's a lot of alarm about China, certainly. Now, as for the, what was the first?
I think that covered it.
No, there was a first question that was
China infiltrating Congress.
Oh, Texas in the
Texas,
state.
5
Yeah.
states, That'd be cool.
Well, yeah, that would, well,
Would Austin be its own state?
yeah, right. You could get
Kind of
a couple of states that would have Democratic senators. I mean, this raises an interesting question, and this is something that I wouldn't be surprised to see happen over the next 20 years in the United States, if indeed the United States remains a country. This takes no constitutional amendment, right? This just an act of Congress makes a state. South Dakota became a state, act of Congress. North Dakota became a state, act of Congress. My state of West Virginia broke off from Virginia, became a state, act of Congress. So all it takes, if Texas wants to split into 5 states, Congress has to approve it. District of Columbia becomes a state, Congress. Puerto Rico, Congress. California become 3-4 states. I wouldn't be surprised to see this. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see this happen.
Quick plug for your book coming out in September. It's economic based.
Thanks. Yeah, it's called The Middle Out. And that's a phrase that Biden uses sometimes, but other people have invented and developed it, that prosperity grows from the middle out, not from the top down, that it is through a creation of a robust middle class and a secure middle class that we have better growth, economic growth, and that we sustain democracy and increase personal freedom, because we give people more freedom to make more choices for their lives to fulfill their potential in fuller ways. So the book is partly a history, a political economic history of the United States. And then it's a look at how things have been developing in the last 10 or 15 or so years, when people have been trying to make this argument and advance these, not only these policies, but these arguments about how our economy could be arranged in a different way to benefit, as Madison said, to the greatest benefit of the greatest number. And then the last chapter has my recommendations for how Democrats ought to be talking about these things. It's a really important question for our times, because I would just say this. I know I need to wrap up here in a second, but from the 1930s through the 1970s, we had a broadly shared prosperity in this country. It wasn't as broadly shared as it should have been. It didn't include Black Americans, and it didn't include most women who didn't work outside the home, except for during the years of the war. But we did have a growing middle class, far less economic inequality than we have today, far less, and far less economic anxiety in the working and middle classes, and more economic security. In the 1970s, this started to change because our economic priorities started to change. Broadly speaking, we went from Keynesianism to Milton Friedmanism, and I won't elaborate on those now. Buy my book and you'll see. But what has happened in the last 40 years is a massive transfer of wealth from the middle class to not only the top 1%, but the top 0.1%. Massive transfer of wealth, trillions and trillions of dollars, such that the average median income today in the United States is about $40,000. There's been a study by the Rand Corporation. If that wealth hadn't been transferred, the average median salary would be in the high 50s. That's what this transfer of wealth has done. Nobody knows this. Democrats don't talk about it. Americans don't know this. I know it. If you read the book, you'll know it. I hope a lot of people read it and get to know it. Democrats need to talk about these things. So that's what the book is about. And it's intimately tied, in my mind, and I'll finish here, to democracy and freedom. A stronger middle class makes for a stronger democracy. Thomas Jefferson believed this very devoutly, wrote about it a lot, acted on it a lot. A stronger middle class makes for a stronger democracy, and it gives people more personal freedom to make more choices about what they want to do with their lives. So I hope you'll give it a look. I'm coming back here to Gramercy Books sometime in September. I hope you'll keep an eye out for it, and thank you all a million for listening.
While you're waiting, for that, check out this one. It's really good. It's troubling, and melatonin's a wonderful drug. Kelly.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we all know what we need to be doing and what we need to be on the lookout for. So thank you to our Democracy in Crisis series partner, WOSU Public Media, and to the Columbus Dispatch for its support for today's forum. Thank you to our online virtual seat patrons and to the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation for presenting our live stream in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. And our special appreciation to today's speakers, Michael Tomasky and our host, Mike Thompson. And please make plans to join us next week for a forum on the recent changes to abortion laws in Ohio with hosts Jesse Baumert and Dan Coble from Capital University. I thank you all. Okay, most important thing, thank you all for joining us. We're so glad that you're here. You make the forum, you make everything, so we couldn't do it without you. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday as the Columbus Metropolitan Club presents another community conversation. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.